start the recording? Okay, we're ready to go. Okay, Mia, please.
Okay, great, thank you. So good afternoon for the friends in Geneva and in European time zone, and good evening, good morning to other people around the world. For those that have not met me, my name is Mia Mikic, and I'm honored and fortunate as a new member of the Friends of Multilateralism group to be given this opportunity to open this webinar. And allow me a few words to introduce the group for those who are joining for the first time. The Friends of Multilateralism group was established in 2016 in Geneva as a think tank of independent experts who are fully and firmly committed to promoting multilateralism and shared prosperity underpinned by the functioning multilateral trading system. And the group endeavors to bolster efforts of the WTO members of their delegations in Geneva and the capital-based officials to engage in WTO reform and other issues of importance to the multilateral trading system, with a view to restoring the centrality of the emboldened WTO for the governance of international trade and let me also say of investment. The group strives to provide high quality, independent and expert advice through different type of activities and the production of various knowledge products to help build a positive ecosystem to inform and support potential compromises and landing zones for the sustainability of the multilateral trading system. And a perfect example of such activities is actually the brainstorming session that we'll be having today. This session is centered around the just released ebook entitled Rebooting Multilateral Trade Cooperation, Perspectives from China and Europe. And the book presents the findings of a recent joint work of the European University Institute and the University of International Business and Economics under the project with a great name, Respect, Realizing Europe's Soft Power in External Cooperation and Trade. And the speakers will add more on the project, but the project actually brought together the experts and scholars from European and Chinese side on trade policy and features their chapters. And it's motivated really by the shifts that happen in the global economy that influence trade and international transactions between countries, but that actually escaped somehow the governance or even the involvement of the multilateral trading system. So we all witnessed increased tensions, protectionism, expanding scope of trade policies to include sort of non-trade objectives within the ecological and social area, the rise of powerful trading nations, and the changed perspective on reciprocity, etc. And so all of these actually are part of the investigations of the book, and we'll be hearing about that later. So I think without losing more time, because we are really keen to hear from the speakers and discussants, let us dive into this brainstorming, and to lead us through it and to moderate the session. We have none other but the vice chair of the group, Patrick Law. And Patrick, of course, doesn't need any special introduction, but I have to emphasize his crucial role in actually building knowledge capacity of the current and what their future, but our current negotiators and trade policy makers around the world, but in particular in Asia through the Asian Global Institute and his advisory role in ArtNet, for which I personally am very thankful to him. So he was, of course, the chief economist in the WTO and had many other important functions. And we all know how crucial he is for the building the knowledge on trade agenda. So with this, I think I should give the mic and the floor to Patrick to run us through the session.
You definitely should, and none too soon. Thank you, Mia. Welcome, everybody. The presentation by Bernard and Xinquan is for 25 minutes. You've got 25 minutes, so I think the best thing is that you get on with it.
Very good. So I'll start. Thanks for everybody for participating. I'm going to share my screen. So Xinquan and I are going to basically divvy up the presentation. I'm trying to figure out how to share my screen. I don't see.
Bernard, if you open the PPT and you click on the screen, and below there you will see a share screen button. You click it and you choose your PPT, and it's on. And you could.
Yeah, no, that's the way it should work. But what I'm seeing is who can share and who can start sharing when someone else is sharing. So it's asking me things I shouldn't have to answer.
Okay, and then I will put you as the host. Probably you have, yeah, you're not the host now. I think probably you got it here on your screen. You see the share screen?
No, it doesn't. I just get into this advanced sharing options screen. Sorry about this, but
okay. Or the other thing is that probably you could. I ask Natalie to run it for you.
That's fine. Yeah, just put it up. I mean,
okay.
I think Xinquan will have the same problem. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, Natalie is sharing now, so you just tell her when to do.
Great. Okay, thanks.
Yeah,
so sorry about the technical snafu. So we're going to be talking about a book that has just been published by CEPR. It's on the VoxEU homepage. It's freely downloadable. And essentially, as Mia already mentioned, the idea here was to bring together European and Chinese practitioners, experts, scholars, to think about what are the priority issues confronting the multilateral trading system, in particular the WTO, and think about the WTO reform agenda. And the main idea, next slide, please, is, and I'll skip all this because it's been said by Mia, the main kind of notion, the premise we had is that China and the EU are the two biggest trading powers in the world today. And the question we're asking is, can they cooperate to revitalize the WTO as a forum for agreeing on new rules for trade and to reestablish the WTO as a venue for the settlement of trade disputes? The book is split into two parts. One part deals with institutional questions. The second part deals more with negotiating topics, particular subjects that are the cause of international spillovers. So this is just a table of contents. You can read all the papers. What we're going to do in the next 20 minutes or so is just quickly take you through the main messages. I should stress this is very much my and Xinquan's take. Authors might have a slightly different view of what the priorities are. There's a lot more wealth of analysis in the chapters than we can do justice to in these 20 minutes. Next slide, please. So two premises underpin what we did. On the one hand, one premise is that resolving the institutional challenges confronting the WTO is really critical. And clearly there's a lot of emphasis on negotiations. There's a lot of emphasis on particular policy questions, which are giving rise to trade tensions. But the view of the project is essentially, we're not going to move very far if we don't fix some of these fundamental institutional challenges that confront the organization. In particular, kind of creating a governance structure for plurilateral agreements, dealing with the transparency problems that confront the organization, resolving the dispute settlement crisis, and differentiating between the development status of a country and access to special and differential treatment type provisions that are embedded in the various agreements. Right, so that's the first premise. If we can't deal with those issues, then anything else we might have in terms of smart ideas about negotiating on topic X or Y is really not going to go very far, because these fundamental constraints are going to kick in. The second premise, and that's mainly informing the choice of issues in the second part of the book, is that the focus really should be on instances where policies, national policies, are creating large negative systemic spillovers that are of interest to many, if not all, WTO members, and that as a result of that, we have to focus both on old issues for which there are already agreements and new issues where there is less in the way of existing agreements. Next slide, please. Over to you, Xinquan. You're muted.
Okay, thank you, Bernard. Then I will introduce the main findings and suggestions on these institutional issues. Actually, I would add a few words on the initiation of this program. Actually, this idea of organizing a China-EU dialogue on WTO reform emerged when I had a talk with Professor Wang Dong of Peking University, who is a key actor in think tank dialogues between US and China in last September, I think. Both of us were regretting that the bilateral communications had been badly disrupted, but we agreed that China should keep open to dialogues with the outside world regarding the global issues. Therefore, we proposed that Chinese and European scholars could jointly do something to support the multilateral trading system favored by both sides, but weakened due to a variety of factors. Then I got made a list of questions, actually, and I got a quick and positive response from Bernard, and we reached out to the prominent scholars on every issue and also got quick and positive response. So I really appreciate our participants for their great contributions. Then I will briefly introduce the main findings and suggestions on the systemic issues on behalf of these authors. I hope my introduction will be precise. Sorry. Next page, please. Okay, the first issue is about negotiation by me and Professor Robert Wolff. Professor Wolff and I argue that the joint engagement of three powers, EU, China, and US, is critical for the functioning of the WTO as reflected in the history of previous negotiations. But one problem is that there are no bridge clubs, including all three powers right now. The existing arrangements are basically bilateral. Then the EU and China should take more leadership since they share many common ideas about the multilateral trading system, while the US remains reluctant to support the key functions of the WTO. One possible choice is to pursue open plurilateral agreements on specific issues. Both the EU and China are obvious supporters of this approach, as shown by their active participation in all ongoing four joint statement initiative negotiations. However, open plurilaterals are not a panacea because they are still subject to consensus restraint and opposed by some influential members. So proponents of plurilateral engagement should put in place new governance principles to assure non-participating WTO members that any plurilateral agreement will be supportive of the rules-based multilateral trading system. So we believe that the key issue here is not the participants, but non-participants. So then the three leading members, the three powers, EU and China and the US, should take the lead to develop those principles and set the basis for more plurilateral negotiations and possible agreements. Besides, even if plurilateral negotiations replace a single undertaking as an aggregation and enforcing mechanism, it is still important to recognize that the need for issue linkage and package deals is likely to remain. So which means that plurilateral approach cannot solve all problems. Many issues are still subject to the multilateral approach. And also, in some cases, issue linkage is necessary for the success of plurilateral agreements on negotiations. Next page, please. Okay, the second issue is about transparency by Professors Evenett and Kong. They argue that WTO agreements have numerous formal notification obligations. However, inadequate notification of trade policies is long-standing and widespread. It's not a member-specific issue. It's a common issue for many members. Among these issues, subsidies are a key concern in discussions on transparency at the WTO because governments are more reluctant to report this important domestic policy, which is not necessarily related to trade, to the WTO. In particular, members have big problems in notifying local subsidies, as exemplified in both the US and China. The authors compare the practices of the two countries and find that both of them have big problems here. But it's also not only limited to the two members. I think many other members also have big problems here. A priority in enhancing subsidy transparency is to bolster the evidence on substantial subsidies. So they argue this would be a very important area. They also review available information on this and showing that such support is prevalent in both countries and has systematic implications. So enhancing transparency of central and sub-central subsidy programs is important for both the national and the local governments concerned, and not just to potentially affected competitors. Better information and greater transparency will help make local government more accountable and reduce the scope for wasteful internal competition between subnational jurisdictions. So it also has a very important domestic implications. So it would also permit central governments to submit more timely and comprehensive notifications to the WTO and allow for evidence-based deliberation of the cross-border ramifications of national subsidy policy. Next page, please. Okay. Then third issue is about dispute settlement by Professors Liao and Mavroidis. The WTO dispute settlement system, which is held as the crown jewel of the multilateral regime, has been tarnished as a result of unilateral actions taken by the Trump administration. although the US was supportive of this kind of depoliticized, independent adjudication at the beginning or during the establishment of the WTO, the Walker process led by Ambassador David Walker tried hard to satisfy US requirements, but failed to bring the US back. And now we are not sure whether the Biden administration would like to come back. They are still waiting for something. Then the EU and China jointly sponsored the MPIA, which is a valuable attempt, but not a long-term or permanent solution, as the authors argue. Then if we want to reestablish the effective dispute settlement mechanism, the US has to be brought on board. The authors argue that preserving the depoliticized character of the DSU should be the focus of the negotiators. AB or no AB, this is not the key issue. Although right now, both the EU and China prefer a two-tier judicial system, but also think that this is not the key. But the independence and the depoliticization of the dispute settlement mechanism matters more. So what matters is that judges are left alone to decide on disputes, not influenced by member governments. And at the same time, the WTO has to solve the legislative crisis and to make a substantial progress in rulemaking. Otherwise, they believe that the dispute settlement mechanism will be too burdensome to make decisions on those uncovered issues. So then both EU and China should deliver clear signals of willingness to engage in negotiations on substantive issues. Next page, please. Okay, then the fourth systemic issue is about special and differential treatment by Patrick Lowe. He suggests that WTO members determine their own development designation, but most aspects of SDT require cooperative action of one kind or another from other members. This is a big kind of disparity here. A distinction, then a distinction must be made between a regulatory SDT and the market access SDT. The two kinds of SDT have very different meanings. The former focus on the rules of the trading system, while the latter are instrumental in determining the terms of participation in a given market. When it comes to market access SDT, non-reciprocal tariff and the quota preferences are offered and withdrawn on a non-contractual basis under the full control of the party granting the concessional access. I think which means that other parties have the freedom to give or cancel the SDT. Analysis of the application of these elements of SDT to the WTO agreements shows that the only element of regulatory SDT exclusively in the hands of beneficiary pertains to the flexibility category. So this category is a really kind of valuable regulatory SDT. Access to every other aspect of regulatory SDT requires cooperative action of one kind or another from other WTO members, which is similar to the market access SDT. So then the flexibility category of SDT constitutes less than 1/4 of all SDT provisions, thus limiting the scope for opportunistic access to SDG by those considered undeserving. So basically, this kind of SDG is the only problematic SDG right now, or under questioning. So then the WTO should take action to determine which members actually make use of this subset of SDG as a useful way of informing governments whether flexibilities are indeed used, and to provide a basis for decisions by individual WTO members to indicate they do not intend to do so in the future. So these are introduction about the 4 issues, the 4 papers. If the authors have something to add, you can raise your hand later. Thank you.
Okay. Great. So let's, I know we're running out of time, so let's not discuss this particular slide. There are a couple of chapters in the book which we can come back to in the question and answer session, which really deal with the fraud issue of linking trade to non-trade objectives, right? So one of them has to do with national security and invocation of national security as a reason for exemptions. Another one has to do with trade and climate, which of course is becoming a big issue today. So next slide, please. So let me take 5 minutes to kind of go through some of these substantive negotiating issues. One is agriculture. And agriculture, of course, is something which is a core, it's kind of core business of the WTO, has been for decades. And the paper by Lou and Alan Matthews kind of takes you through where are we going? And one of the points they stress is that although this was in the past very much an issue that involved the EU, the US, industrialized countries, today developing nations are much more centrally involved in this particular issue area. They account for 60% of global food trade, but also if you look at domestic support measures as defined by the Agreement on Agriculture, they increasingly account for a larger share of total domestic support. I think one of the key messages of this paper is, and it links to some of the other issues, subsidies is a common denominator of many of the issues we're going to talk about. But one of the things the authors stress, which I think is extremely important, is that there's a real urgent need to revisit the methodology that is used to calculate product-specific support in agriculture, right? And in a sense, this is something that doesn't really work because countries are penalized even if they transfer resources to farmers at above market prices, right? So this is something they stress should be a priority to address. Another thing they emphasize is that there is a real link here to the climate change agenda, which is one reason why thinking about agriculture as a potential subject for a plurilateral agreement really doesn't make a lot of sense. So this is one area where the traditional approach of package deals and linkages is likely to be needed to move forward. Next slide. There are 3 chapters in the book that deal with subsidies and state-owned enterprises. 3 in part because authors had different views, and in part, of course, because it's an important topic. And as was already emphasized in the chapter by Simon and Professor Kong, subsidies are really where a lot of the action is taking place today. That includes both central and subcentral entities providing subsidies. The papers by Professor Li and Professor Rubini and Liu. So Li and Rubini really emphasize the need for improving our information base on subsidies. The Global Trade Alert has done a really good job in tracking what is going on. One of the things that comes out of those exercises is that it's clear that this is not just one particular country that is a problem. All countries are using subsidies. Of course, now with COVID, we've seen the share of subsidies in total measures affecting international competition increase. And what Li and Rubini argue, echoing work that has been done by others in this area, is we really need to do a better job at understanding what actually creates significant distortions, what creates significant spillovers on world markets, and what type of subsidies should actually be considered to be okay, right? So non-actionable. And as you know, this non-actionable category of subsidies is no longer found in the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. So this is one area that they say we should be focusing on. But the key message here is let's first do our homework. And we haven't done enough of the homework to actually be able to identify where those large spillovers are. The same message is made with respect to state-owned enterprises, state-controlled enterprises, where André Sapir and I argued, echoing work that André has done with Deborah Mavroidis in a recent book. The focus really should be on the behavior of these entities as opposed to ownership per se. And there's lots of different permutations through which states can actually influence what firms do. So the focus should be on the activities of those firms, and in particular, where those activities create negative effects on international competition. What the chapter argues, and this is something you also find in other chapters throughout the book, is that there's a lot that could be learned from recent trade agreements, but also investment agreements. And in particular, because the focus of this book is on China, EU, a number of the chapters dig into some depth into the new treaty that has been negotiated by the European Union and China, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, which actually covers these areas in some depth. And there's quite a bit of innovation, I would argue, in the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment in terms of how you deal with this problem of state-owned enterprises, where the approach that was taken was to focus on what is called covered entities, which doesn't predefine what the scope of that coverage should be, right? So this could include a mix of different types of entities, and it kind of builds on this notion we have in EU law on undertakings as opposed to SOEs. So here again, one of the messages is we don't know enough about SOEs, however we define them. What we do know is that they're mostly in Europe and in East Asia Pacific. Within the East Asia Pacific, of course, China accounts for a very large share of all SOEs, but it means that the EU and China have a common kind of have a much more interest in this particular issue area than other countries, and therefore they should be taking the lead in undertaking the work that is actually required to identify, where is the behavior of these companies creating negative competitive spillover effects. And here, of course, the European Union has its own model, which is tied to how we deal with subsidies in Europe. And we argue in the paper, there's quite a lot to be learned from that approach looking forward. But essentially what it means for WTO reform is we need to kind of revisit the rules that apply in this area. Next slide, please. Okay, then finally, there are 3 chapters which deal with services, digital trade, e-commerce, and investment. All of these topics have been on the WTO table for a long time. Investment was one of the Singapore issues that was taken off the table in the early 2000s. E-commerce and domestic services regulation are issues that date back to the late 1990s. We, of course, have the General Agreement on Trade and Services. One common theme of these chapters underlying or motivating these chapters is there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of even making commitments on applied policies, right? So if you look at services trade restrictiveness indicators, you'll see that in the last 10 years or so, there's been a gradual reduction in the level of restrictiveness, but the absolute level of restrictiveness is still quite high. And a lot of that has not been bound in the GATS. So what the papers argue is that there actually is quite a lot of scope for cooperation in this area. Partly that optimism, and it's qualified optimism, is based on the fact that we see both China and the European Union actually having made more commitments in a number of these areas in regional trade agreements. And again, what some of the chapters argue is that there's scope to actually build on what has been agreed in those agreements and to transfer some of that to the WTO and make that the basis of a potential agreements that are open and plurilateral. Now, of course, the e-commerce talks are ongoing as a joint statement initiative. And we argue a similar approach could be taken to actually expand the coverage of the GATS. And that is actually important because if you think about the world economy today, it is very much a services, increasingly digital economy that creates a need to actually cooperate on regulatory policies in these areas. What the chapters emphasize is we need to be realistic, obviously. There are a lot of issue areas that are sensitive, where countries disagree quite a lot in terms of what the regulatory objectives are and how to pursue them. But that doesn't undercut the importance of actually having these discussions and seeking to agree on issue areas, which even if they are not the most ambitious things that international business might want, that can actually help improve the governance of trade in these areas, updating the coverage of the GATS, locking in more of applied policy in the GATS, promoting transparency, enhancing predictability, supporting international regulatory cooperation, right? So I think there's a lot there that can be taken from what's been done in the regional bilateral context and to use this instrument of open plurilateral agreements to move forward to expand existing multilateral agreements. Next page. Okay, let me skip this in the interest of time. Just to reiterate that some of the main messages here is we really need to, we would argue, or at least Xinquan and I would argue, is that a key priority is to establish a robust enabling environment for open plurilateral agreements. That is the direction of travel. It's clearly the revealed preference of WTO members, and we see that in the negotiation of hundreds of preferential trade agreements. Multilateralizing that dynamic and putting it into the WTO, we would argue, is something which would help the trading system. There's a lot of potential issue areas which could be pursued in this way. Trade and climate is one, public health and learning from the pandemic would be another one. But none of that is going to work if we don't create that enabling environment, if we don't create a clear legal path for introducing these types of agreements in the WTO, and if we don't deal with the concerns that WTO members that do not want to participate in these types of initiatives have, right? So that really is something we stress in the book. China and the EU are the two largest trading players, in the WTO. Both are committed to multilateral rules-based system. And we argue in the book, and if you take away a lot of the messages in the chapters, is they really should take the lead in working with like-minded countries to support the work that is necessary to build a basis for expanding the scope for plurilateral engagement and identifying where and how that cooperation might take place. So a key necessary condition for this is informed deliberation. Many of the chapters call for work programs to prepare the ground. Clearly, the Secretariat has an important role to play, working with other international organizations. We haven't had time to kind of go into this in the short period of time we have available to us. But again, it all boils down to where Xinquan started off with in his chapter with Robert Wolff. We need the three major players to work together on dealing with these issues, trying to identify a path forward. And that is something which, as outsiders at any rate, we think currently has been lacking, may still be lacking, but it is really something that needs to be addressed. Next slide, please. So the book can be downloaded from Vox EU. Like I said, neither of us have done complete justice to the chapters. There's a lot more richness in the papers. I would also point you to another set of articles that deal with WTO reform that appeared in Global Policy in April, which has a complementary set of articles, which are also supported by the project that this ebook is part of, the Respect program that Mia introduced at the beginning. So for those of you who are interested in that, please have a look at the Global Policy special issue as well. And that goes into much greater depth on things like open plurilateral agreements, but also on the more nitty-gritty things that could be done to help make the WTO infrastructure work more effectively. So there's a very rich and interesting paper by Robert Wolff in the Global Policy issue which deals with that dimension of how the WTO works. Let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Bernard, and thank you, Xinquan. We now have 4 discussants. Xiaozhun, from former DDG, former boss, who's now at UIBE. Alan Wolff, another former boss, DDG, who's now at Peterson Institute in Washington. Then we have Jean-Marie Paugam, who is a current DDG. And we have Debbie Elms, who's the founder and executive director of the Asian Trade Center. So please, could you do your best to stick to 7 minutes, 8 minutes, because we ran over a bit with the presentation, and it would be nice to have some time at the end for a bit of Q&A. And on that topic, if anyone wishes to ask questions, please write them in the Q&A box. Thank you. Okay, so Xiaozhun, over to you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you for inviting me to join this interesting discussion. I also want to thank Bernard and Xinquan for their informative presentation. Let me send my greetings to all the works done for the publication of this ebook. In this ebook, I observed many shared perspectives among Chinese and European scholars towards sustaining an open and inclusive multilateral trading system and improving the functioning and the relevance of the WTO. Here, I would like to offer a few brief points. First, advancing trade cooperation in the WTO is critical to the global post-pandemic recovery. Second, multilateral trade cooperation has become more difficult in recent years, and the WTO seems less capable of addressing the growing challenges facing members. Third, if cooperation in the WTO continues to slow or stall, members will be compelled to turn increasingly to regional approaches, with the risk of further weakening multilateral trade cooperation, unraveling economic integration, and exacerbating geopolitical tensions. And fourth, for global trade cooperation to succeed, members need to want to cooperate with one another to engage in mutually beneficial exchanges and to find a win-win outcome for all parties. There's no reform shortcut. It is widely acknowledged that China and the EU play a critical role in keeping the WTO fit for purpose in a rapidly changing world economy. Over the past few years, the rising unilateralism and protectionism have undermined the authority and functioning of the WTO. In these difficult times, both China and the EU have chosen to stand on the right side of economic globalization, firmly supported the multilateral trading system, and resisted trade protectionism. Facing with the WTO appellate body crisis, it is the EU and China putting forward joint proposals to defend the core value of the appellate body while promoting rational reform of dispute settlement, which have received support from many members. Facing with the stalled WTO trade agenda, it is China and the EU cooperating in promotion of joint statement initiatives in areas such as investment facilitation and the domestic regulation of trading services, which have provided innovative approach to WTO negotiations. Furthermore, in my view, China and the EU have broad potential of cooperation on issues such as initiatives of medical products and services against COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the environmental efforts to reduce the trade of single-use plastics. Even for those challenging issues regarding SOEs, labor, and environment, China and the EU have managed to find a way to build consensus and deal with disputes as shown in the successful conclusion of EU-China Comprehensive Investment Agreement. Inspired by this ebook, China and the EU could enhance dialogues and mutual understandings in a variety of areas to make efforts in revitalizing the WTO. The in-depth analysis and the policy-oriented suggestions for each specific area of WTO functioning and rulemaking raised in this ebook merit the most thorough reading and reflection, and could be considered by trade negotiators, government practitioners, and trade communities. In conclusion, let me congratulate UIBE, EUI, and Peking University for what I consider to be a really worthwhile contribution to global trade governance studies centered on the WTO. I appreciate the efforts made by the CEPR group to publish the ebook. My thanks also go to the FMG to provide a platform for brainstorming on the ebook. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Xiaozhun. Over to you, Alan.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And my thanks to, I will not give all the encomia that Xiaozhun just did, because he's done it for me. This is a great book. It's very useful. It's very thought-provoking. I think it's a very useful guide for everyone, including those who are new to the system, those who have been in it for some time, with respect to analyses, with respect to history, especially I think Patrick's history on special and differential treatment, Rubini Lee history on subsidies. And there are many illuminating ways of moving forward. So a good analytical toolkit. It's thought-provoking. I don't agree with everything, but nobody will. It's worth the reader's time and reflection. What it's not designed to do, I think, is really have a solution to the problems of leadership and level of ambition. The level of ambition is anemic at best on the part of the majors. An answer to the whether you go across the street as the CSIS commission to form a compact and just move forward with those who are willing. First of all, there is no way that there is a unity of view of willingness. So that's not an immediate threat, but it's a threat down the road. I think an existential threat to the WTO, although they see it as a way forward. How do you manage geopolitical rivalry is not really the focus of this particular book. And I don't know what happens to the WTO as the rivalry heats up even further potentially, although there are ways to have some areas of cooperation. The role of the Secretariat, I'll have to look at the Robert Wolff article to see whether there's more there. There are little bits here and there of saying that WTO Secretariat ought to do more. The current fight in Geneva, which was a fight before Ngozi took over and is even sharper now, is whether there should be increased funding, the use of trust funds. It's going to be a major issue. US and India are allied, which means they're up to no good. I have a question about China and EU joint authorship in terms of what's left out on occasion. But this is a valuable start, but it may not be sufficient. So overriding questions. To what extent will China move beyond the status quo in support of the system? I think that's an open question. The Chinese view is not that it is fighting for the status quo, but that's my impression. Will the EU be more capable of driving the process forward? The EU had announced, Sabine Weyand announced at the TPR of the EU that they had a wonderful paper on WTO reform. This was I think in late 2018 or early 2019, maybe it was late 2019 that she was talking. And I turned to our colleague Karl Brauner and said, what paper on WTO reform is she talking about? And he said, I don't know, I'll find out. And it turned out to be a paper that the Commission gave to the EU Parliament. Didn't come to Geneva for a long time. So there's a question of whether the EU is capable of leadership in that sense, although they've emerged I think to a much greater extent now. What brings the US back to the table? On the appellate body, given the geopolitical rivalry, will the US engage on what I think is necessary, bringing us back to binding dispute settlement? The jury's out on that. They might, I didn't approve at all, and I don't think they would have either of the US, this administration wouldn't have approved of the Trump administration's blocking appointments to the appellate body. But that's where we are. And the question is, how do we climb back? And I'm not sure there's a lot of willingness, appetite in Washington for climbing back. This is not a Trump administration issue. It's an issue that is far broader and deeper. What happens to MFN in all of this? Good to have open plurilateral agreements, but there will be some real stresses with respect to MFN. What happens to consensus decision-making, which is addressed in these papers? The role of the Director General, and Ngozi is announcing and seeing whether anybody's, I don't know if she's turning around and seeing whether anyone's following her, but sooner or later you have to turn around and see whether you have the members on board. And that's interesting. What should the role be of the Secretariat? In a couple of places, there's in this book, there's a talk about an increased role. I look at the Global Trade Alert and I say, why isn't the WTO doing that? And there are well-known reasons, and Simon has explored them and is very knowledgeable about them. But we talk about transparency. There needs to be some steroids administered to the Secretariat. That's both money and mandate. Is the WTO about convergence? Patrick says not so much on going to total openness of trade in his chapter. I'm all for convergence on a great goal of total openness, as well as regulatory. He's on board for the regulatory aspects of convergence. So is trade liberalization dead? Is a question. The must-dos. COVID, I think, number one, and Ngozi sees that. CBAM, the carbon border adjustment measures, imperative. Subsidies, which is something that this series of 3 chapters do a very good job on, and agricultural data flows. I wrote for my own self, my own use notes. I'll send them to Natalie. She can get them around on other questions that I think are worth raising individually on the chapters. Again, I recommend this book. I have recommended this book to, yesterday I met with the trade minister, said, got to read this. She's not going to, but somebody will read it for her and give her a précis. But I'll do my best to get this book circulated in Geneva and elsewhere. So thank you to the authors and the editors very much.
Thank you, Alan. Now it's for Jean-Marie. Jean-Marie, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you and good afternoon, everyone. Like I would like to first commend the authors for the project. I think it's extremely useful to try to shed a light on the nexus between the relation between the three major powers, and it's obvious that the transatlantic and trans-Pacific relations are more explored than the EU-China. So I think it's really worth, sometimes psychotic to try to find the convergences between EU and China, but I think it's really worth and useful. So thank you. There are also, as Alan just pointed out, many good ideas taking away in the book, recommending also, and that's another reason for commending. More in detail, I'd like to share some remarks, which would be, if you allow me, personal remarks. I would not like to speak on behalf of the Secretariat, else I would say very different things. Maybe on the negotiating function and what has been said by Xinquan on the plurilateral, the nexus between single undertaking consensus versus plurilateral critical mass and trade-off and linkages to get a deal. And the first thing, I think, I agree that the plurilateral is not a panacea, because you will have to find those trade-offs. And maybe we can look at what happened during the DDA. And I believe that there are two really big lessons which came out of the difficulties of the DDA. Is that the first one is that all the countries have been entering this negotiation with very different purposes from different objectives since inception. There were one camp of country which entered the round to liberalize the world trade. There is another one, and that was mostly the Kent Group, the US, and others. There was one which entered the Doha round for regulatory reason, more interested by the Singapore issues. That was more the EU. And there were a last group which entered the round to rewrite the rules of the Uruguay round. And I think this was a fundamental reason of the impossibility of the single undertaking for once. The second reason, I think, has been pointed out by Patrick in the context of special and differential treatment, but it is the Doha round was proposing to trade off rules and market access. How do you trade off rules and market access? Actually, it proved probably impossible. So these are lessons that we need to take on with us, I think, when we look at the plurilaterals. And I am not sure that when you look at all the GSIs, there is no also constructive ambiguity in the objectives of the negotiation that might lead to some more difficult times later on. Now, the second point is about probably the issue of critical mass or the status of the norm. I think that we all come about rebooting the WTO system with the vision, the classical vision, that WTO is here to exchange trade concession through hard law. And this raises the issue either of consensus or critical mass to get an agreement. But I'm not sure that this tells all the story for the future. That is, if you consider that this organization also has to consider delivering public goods rather than mere trade concessions, then the look at the critical mass and the way to promote agreement and the status of the norm changes. And we might see in the future some degraded versions of the hard law that we know, which is the standard law of the WTO, toward several shades of soft law, which might have an operating impact. If you look at what we are doing today in WTO, there are two issues which have a lot of public good dimension. The first one is fisheries. It's about preservation of the ocean. And the second one is health, as have been mentioned. So on other issues of that type, maybe the critical mass will start with some more progressive core group aggregating around more flexible kind of commitment. At least this is a question that I'm putting on the table. My second point is about transparency. I very much agree with what was mentioned by Alan on the role of the Secretariat. There is an elephant in the room here on transparency, is that you have two models possible for transparency. One is a passive one, where transparency is made by the members. They notify to the Secretariat their trade measures, and we compilate them. It is the most common and the main model in the WTO today. The other one is a semi-active one, where the Secretariat can endeavor to look for information and then validate it with members. This is also what we do for the monitoring, for instance, of trade restrictive measures since 2008. And it is operating quite well. And of course, there are models in other institutions where the Secretariat could do more. That's a question for the members to consider. But the question, I think Alan referred to that in terms of steroids needed in the Secretariat. is something which is open, but probably something could happen better on transparency. I don't want to touch upon the specific issues because they are being negotiated, and actually previous discussant mentioned them, so I will leave it to the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jean-Marie. I don't see any questions in the Q&A box. So just in case anyone has any questions, please do put them in there, and certainly for the attendees. I presume, Lou, that the attendees have access to the Q&A box? Yeah, so please feel free to do that. And now we turn to Debbie.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. I'm a little intimidated. You hate to go after, Director General spoke, but nonetheless, I wanted to say, first of all, that I enjoyed this book a lot more than I thought I would. Not that it didn't have an all-star cast. You often have books with an all-star cast, and then somehow something kind of goes wrong and you end up with a sort of mushy mess. I actually really like this. First of all, I like the China-EU focus because it's different, or at least it's different from what I typically read. I think it's very useful. Of course, there are several challenges around that, but I liked it as a framing device. I thought there was a lot to be had from that. I thought it was very useful. And of course, the participants in this project have long history, lots of knowledge, tons of pragmatic, practical advice, all of which I like. I think that's critically important in understanding how you got where you got and where you might go from here, given all of that knowledge and background and so forth. But it does then leave you a little bit, and if I had more time, I probably would think of other things to say, but let me just say briefly, it leaves you a little bit at the end with a concern about the overall level of ambition. And I don't know if that comes from it being the EU and China and sort of trying to figure out a common platform by which these two parties could cooperate, but you end up at the end of this book, which has awesome ideas in general, again, and lots of key issues that are raised, feeling like the level of ambition at the end is kind of nowhere near as much as you would like. Now, part of me really likes that because it's pragmatic and that's where we're at, and why shoot for the stars if you can't possibly get there? So let's focus on what you can deliver. But one of the things that you end up with then is let's do more data collection. Now, I am all in favor of data collection. Actually, I think the message should have been reinforced in the book, which is not just data collection for the purpose of data collection, but one theme that comes across that I don't think has been mentioned is the extent to which the current debates, arguments, entrenched positions could be based, and the authors often suggest are based, on faulty, inaccurate, out-of-date information. And so at all sorts of different points in this process, you see authors who are saying, if we had more information, or if we had more accurate information, or if we had more updated information, we might actually get a very different outcome from this particular issue area or from this part of the negotiations, because we are embedding in these discussions outdated, faulty, inexact information. So I do think it's important. But that's still not, I mean, it's ambitious, yes, but not hugely ambitious. There were, another thing that I found interesting was a point that was actually made earlier today, which is you have to think about what are non-participants. The key issue was non-participants. So I thought that was true as well. So what are non-participants? Why are non-participants not participating? It's sort of easy to preach to the converted, and the converted say, of course, this should be done. And of course it matters. And of course the agenda should be larger and should include all the trade and stuff, and all kinds of awesome things could happen. But at the end of the day, you have an awful lot of governments that don't want to participate. They don't want to participate on a voluntary basis. They don't want to be drafted into negotiations. So why not? And I think that's an important part that still needs to be addressed. It comes through a little bit in this book, especially when you talk about the US, which comes in from time to time in sort of peculiar, talking about non-participants at the moment, but comes through in odd times where sort of there's oh, by the way, the Americans probably should be brought into this conversation. It's not just the US. Of course, there are lots of other important but non-participants that really should be addressed. And so I think that for me is a bit missing. If you want to be pragmatic and you want to be practical and you want to get to an outcome, you have to discuss why aren't we getting any outcomes now? Now, I know that's been done to death, but I think this group especially has insights and suggestions for how to cut through a bit of that and understand what are the motivations of non-participants and the motivations of participants, and then try to create some way in which you get this sort of happy nexus, especially in the open plurilateral system where you need to bring people in. And then the last thing I'm just going to say, I wanted to applaud the authors for bringing agriculture onto this book, because it would have been fairly easy to write a book about new issues, new and exciting and sexy stuff like, subsidies or whatever. But I appreciated the fact that agriculture was put back on the table. This is a long-standing issue. It can't be done probably by plurilateral. What are we going to do about it? And I think that is worth remembering throughout all of this. How do you get that core issue resolved, especially with non-participants? So let me just stop there. Thanks.
Many thanks, Debbie, for that. We've got another 20 minutes or so, and I've only got so far one question, which I'm going to read out. I see that Bob Wolff is typing an answer to it, but Bob, instead of typing your answer, why don't you answer the question? Let me just read it out. On WTO reform of the Annex 4 consensus rule, is the pathway restricted to internal WTO negotiations, which themselves would be constrained by consensus, or is it possible to start over with EU, US, China, and perhaps others to negotiate an extra WTO path to plurilateral agreements? Can a compelling issue such as Pandemic Global Health Act as a vehicle for breaking through on this issue? So, Bob.
I think that gets to the heart of one of the things that Xinquan and I were trying to address in our chapter. It's addressed in some of the recent EU documents on WTO reform. And I think, to my mind, the key is to keep negotiations within the WTO, to find a way for the framework of transparency and dispute settlement to encompass negotiations on new issues without the fragmentation of the system that would inevitably happen if countries started negotiating important rules outside the system. So I think that question gets to one of the key challenges for negotiations, but I would not see any virtue in anything happening outside the system.
Yeah, presumably it never come in if it's outside.
Well, exactly.
I don't see any more questions. Alan's got something to say. Alan.
Just a brief comment about moving forward. I was resistant to the idea of the China and the EU are going to get together and pull us out of the rut that we're in, both because of the infirmities of their positions, but also the amount of suspicion there would be in Washington with respect to anything China joins. When China joined the MPIA, it already was not something that Washington, the last administration, wanted to embrace. But I wonder about any two out of the three, and I think that the same is true if the US and Europe decided to sit down, if they were able to, and say, as the US and the UK did at the beginning of the multilateral trading system, and said, we thought this through, and here's what's good for all of you. In current circumstances, I don't know that 2 out of 3 work. So in this book is the idea of a trilateral, which is China, US, EU at one point, which I was somewhat dismissive of. But as I think about it, difficult as it is to even imagine, it might be a way forward. I don't know what the alternatives are. What happened with the JSIs are largely the mid-level countries led. But a question is how to get the WTO back on the road, since I do think it's stuck on the side someplace. And I think that's worth further discussion at some point.
Thanks, Alan. I see another. Lou, do you want to? I got another question, but you want to speak on this?
No, I want to also to ask a question, not necessarily to the speakers, but also to the whole, group here. Is that I think Alan, in his intervention, he made a very good. The previous one, he made a good point about the question on MFN. because our FMG member Hamid has also written this paper on plurilaterals, where FMFN also remains an issue on how to incorporate GSIs into the WTO. And recently, I was talking to some ambassadors. I also heard that informally, some members are already discussing informally about probably that would go ahead with the plurilaterals, which would obviously violate MFN. So I'm still wondering how that would be possible. And this is related also to the question about this kind of extra WTO pass. And I'm still struggling to understand how this would build upon WTO or undermine the WTO. So just something to share. Thank you.
If nobody wants to take up that, I have a question from Dimitri from Russia for Bernard. When you were talking about the perspectives of improvement of the WTO rules for the SOEs, you made a point that the behavior of those companies should be in the center rather than the form of their ownership. In this regard, do you see any room for discussion in WTO of trade distorting behavior of multilateral corporations along with SOEs? Bernard.
You want me to respond now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, because I also can reflect a bit on some of the other points that have been made. So on the SOE question, so kind of both André Sapir and I are European, so we have kind of the European kind of framework in our heads. And that is a framework that very much is a competition policy type of approach. And it makes no distinction between whether a firm or an undertaking is state-owned, state-controlled, private, whatever dimensions of private you might think of. It's really about entities. It's about undertakings who are behaving on the market. And the focus is to ensure that those entities actually behave according to particular rules, which would safeguard competition. Now, that gets us then very quickly into, okay, should we kind of take a competition policy type approach in the WTO, which of course was one of the issues that was put forward by the European Union at the beginning of the Doha round, right? So that was one of the 4 Singapore issues. And logically speaking, I would say, yes, we need to go in that direction. Now, that obviously was quite difficult to do, but I think that's one entry point. Now, clearly, all the focus and all the concerns that have been expressed by governments with respect to behavior of firms is very much focused on SOEs. So what we would argue in the chapter is that, you know, this EU type of approach could help kind of deal with that issue area. And I think what we find interesting in terms of how it was done in the CAI, in the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, was because there you have the 2 players that have the most in the way of SOEs, so Europe and China, of course, very different beasts in practice. But again, conceptually, both have dealt with that question for a long time. You know, they came up with this approach which doesn't really turn on ownership. Now, so if you take an approach which says, okay, we're going to think about covered entities, we're going to think about entities that we think give rise to potential concerns with respect to competition, there's no reason not to include entities where most of the equity is owned by the private sector. If you think about government procurement, the government procurement agreement includes entities that are subject to the rules of the agreement, which have been privatized, right? But they're there because the parties thought we need to think about the behavior of these entities because they're big, they're powerful, they have market power, what have you. So it becomes a matter for negotiation as opposed to a matter of ideologically saying, we don't like SOEs, we should control SOEs, what have you, right? So I think that is one angle, but I think ultimately, you're right in the sense, I think what you're implying is we need to think about this more from the perspective of competition law and policy. So let me stop there. I see we have some more questions. I'd like to respond to a couple of things that were said, especially by Debbie and Alan, but I can come back later.
Yeah, there's a question, there's a sort of question that is, I think, really from Calypso and Nikolaidis, which I think is related to what we've just been talking about. Bernard, in your overall discussions and talking about SOEs, transparencies, subsidies, as well as the new discussions on due diligence, CBAM, etc., would you agree that enforcement issues have become more central than extending new concessions and new rulemaking?
Well, to enforce, you need rules, right? So I think it's, it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. So clearly, if we have agreed rules, then the question becomes how to enforce them. I think there's a legitimate case to be made, and people have made this case in the literature, that countries have not done enough to actually use existing WTO provisions to try and deal with some of these issues. That's an argument that's been made very strongly by Henry Gao in a number of articles. So yes, but I think we need to have those rules in place. And right now, in some of these areas in the WTO, the rules are either not there or they're very patchy. So I think that is something that needs to be addressed first before we can start talking about enforcement. Now, of course, you can enforce national law against whatever, but that doesn't do anything about what happens in third countries, right? And that's really where we need a multilateral system of rules that apply to everyone.
Yeah. Jonathan, rather than me reading out your question, would you like to vocalize it?
Sure, I can, and hi to everyone. Nice to see old friends again. So I take the thrust of the book and the overall discussion as being the big three. But I pause because although I accept that it's necessary to foster joint approaches, in my view, it may be far from sufficient. I've lived through, as have many, reservations on various fronts from agriculture onward expressed by India and South Africa. The LDCs themselves are increasingly vocal regarding our collective failure to address outstanding issues, not so much on S&D, but on fulfilling a sustainable development path. So to any of the panelists or discussants, how do you get from a core solidification of view to a broader consensus that brings in the South? So I'll just stop there.
Any takers for Jonathan's question? Shall we ask the WTO? Shall we ask Jean-Marie? Yeah, why not?
Well, thank you, Patrick, for this one, and thank you, Jonathan. By and large, I think this is a very relevant question, and I tend to agree with both the terms, necessary but not sufficient. Coming from a European background, I can tell you that we have the same type of dynamic when the Germans and the French get together on a proposition. The compromise is already so hard to achieve that most of the people around can find a reflection of their interest. Could that happen in the WTO through any convergence between the three major players? Then I'm quite confident that it would be quite a good step to rally others around. Now, it's not sufficient, and we can see that on, for instance, on an issue like the appellate body, where it's really a very totally different dynamic, where you have almost unanimity less. One where the southern dimension is very present, including the African group has been taking very strong position. So I tend to agree with Jonathan that this is not the end of the story. But I think still that it's very good that the book would try to explore within a WTO context how this interaction works. Because, for instance, the EU-China dynamic is much more active outside the WTO through those bilateral agreements that we have seen on geographical indication, or the so-called CAI, Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, rather than in the WTO, where the commonalities, apart from support to the dispute settlement and rejection of unilateralism, are not so easy to identify. So I think it's still good to start with this core group. Hope I am not circumventing the question too much.
But
well, you know, we'll forgive you, being that you're in office. I just want to add one thought that's, I think, linked to this to some extent, which is to do with the fact that the green room was done away with. I think that was a massive mistake. And I think a green room type format, as long as it's accompanied by the necessary transparency and accountability mechanisms, is really the only way we're going to get any action going on any of these things. And that very much includes what Jonathan's concerned about, which is the bulk of the membership, and whether they're coming along with all this or not. Because increasingly, you know, back in the old days, less good old days, I would argue, it really only took the EU and the US to say that they wanted something badly enough, and it kind of would happen. Now those days are absolutely gone. So you've really got to have a process that allows a full discussion. I think, Lou, you had yours up first, your hand.
Yeah, now I would just want to compliment to what Jean-Marie and you said about this, and in responding to the question of Jonathan, because I recently finished a Chinese paper on the informals and also the role of the big players, and I was teaching my students this morning. So just to share, I mean, this idea, of course, many of you have heard me repeatedly. I was very much supporting this idea of the biggest three. The reason for that is, of course, not just because of their size, but also because of the current geopolitical context, especially between China and the US, which was not very much positive. So that's why I thought that the EU could play a bridge role in getting the two together, and so as to help move things forward among the three. But of course, I very much agree with you, Jean-Marie, and also Jonathan, is that this is only a piece of the whole puzzle to get that two together. But that's probably the first piece we should start with. So just to share with that, thanks.
You want to gang up on the US, huh? Okay. That was a joke. Bob.
Jonathan's question is really interesting. And part of the answer would have to be, what would it take for India to want to do anything? It's not clear that India actually does want to play a positive role. And that's a separate issue that I don't think anybody in the book really had to try to think about. But the other thought experiment would be, what would happen if the big three actually did an equivalent of Blair House, which unblocked the end of the Uruguay round, and said, well, here's some things we're actually going to work on. We don't agree with each other, but we see the basis for an actual negotiation, which has not been happening. I think that's one of the burdens of all the comments. What if the big three said, we would like to do something? What then would the other players in the system do? Would India and South Africa try to block that, or would they have to try to somehow or other figure out where they fit in that? That fundamentally is a big political question, which analytically I don't think we had any purchase on. It's a geopolitical question, as has been mentioned in the comments. There's that. I also want to pick up on Calypso's question, which is also a really interesting one. And here, what you're really talking about is the attitude of the United States more than anybody. And it goes back to the beginning of the previous administration, where the first paper on improving notifications reflected a view that there was no point negotiating new rules if countries weren't implementing the existing rules, if they weren't playing fair and saying what was going on with their trade policies. And now you have a new USTR whose attitude seems to be, first, we're going to enforce the rules. We're going to use all the tools available to us to enforce the rules. And then maybe we'll talk about new rules. This is a very American perspective. And again, it's maybe a different kind of analysis, again, outside the scope of the book, to ask ourselves, what would it take for the United States to be interested in moving the system forward again? We haven't seen much evidence on that. One of the traditional answers from WTO people is, well, there's no business interest. But it's true that we're not seeing a lot of big business saying there's issues that we have that the system should be dealing with, except possibly in the electronic commerce negotiations. And oh, that's the JSI where the Americans do participate.
Yeah, we're getting very close to the end, and I see that Jonathan is muted and unmuted. I don't know, Jonathan.
Well, just a quick,
have the last word.
No, but just a quick footnote, because many of us are old enough to remember an answer to Bob's question. So if you go back to Seattle, the EU and the US, China not yet at the table, spent hours and hours and hours and finally resolved an approach to agriculture. And this was before the labor rights issue came to the fore. And ultimately, India said no. And frankly, that ended the Seattle ministerial even before the labor fiasco. So just to recall a bit of history in that regard, to answer Bob's question as to what India might do. So.
Right, well, that's a cheerful thought. I think actually we've come to the end of our time. Lou, do you want to say anything?
No,
But Bernard wants to say something.
Probably, it's better Bernard and to Xinquan, they say something.
Yeah, so you guys, would you like to say a few closing words?
Yeah, thanks. So let me kick off. So I think one of the things that's, and again, not everything is in this book. Let me just pick up quickly on this level of ambition question. I think it's a really interesting question, actually. And I think partly that was the experiment we were trying to do, to say, okay, what do we get if we put a bunch of people who have thought about this for a long time, but who come from different backgrounds, Chinese versus people based in Europe. And, we got what we got. And I think part of the kind of relatively limited level of ambition is a mix of, let's be pragmatic, but also I think it does reflect, what are we comfortable with individually expressing given where we come from. So we can think about reasons for that, but I think that was part of what we were trying to kind of do in this project. On this issue of the trilateral being necessary but not sufficient, I think that's where these open plurilateral agreements really have potential traction. So I agree, it might not be sufficient, but it's certainly necessary. And I think in many cases, necessary equals sufficient if you take the premise that not everybody has to be on board. And I think that's the direction of travel, I would argue, for the WTO, if the institution is going to stay relevant. The alternative is that things happen outside the organization. So I think part of the problem is a willingness to actually do this, right? And that goes to the questions that Alan put on the table, that others put on the table. Are the EU and China actually willing to lead and engage with the US to actually deal with these, what are pretty fundamental questions? If not, I would argue the system is going to go nowhere and it's going to become increasingly less relevant. If yes, as Bob says, you're going to change the terms of engagement. Because if the large three are going ahead, obviously you want to bring in other countries, but if it also becomes clear that they're not going to let themselves be held up by veto players, which again is what the plurilaterals allow you to do, then I think the dynamics are going to change quite a bit. But again, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The EU has clearly put WTO reform kind of centrally in its trade policy. The question is, what is China willing to do? And again, as I started off with, the level of ambition is perhaps not where some of us would like it to be. And I certainly think it should be higher than it is right now. So let me end with that.
Xinquan, would you like to add anything?
I just want to thank you for your recommendations and comments and suggestions. I think what we are trying to do is just to provide some suggestions to move the multilateral trading system forward. But actually nothing is guaranteed. Sometimes we have to wait for a right timing, probably. As Jonathan mentioned, India destroyed the Seattle ministerial, but India did not block the Doha declaration, although it could do the same thing, right? So, I mean, sometimes when the situation, when all the factors are ready, then we can move the thing forward. So let's keep the hope. Thank you.
Okay. On that note, let's keep the hope. I think we should come to an end because the time has run out. And let me just thank everybody very much for their participation, especially the two presenters and the discussants. And with that, I think it's goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.